Kneading does not fail randomly. When kneading is wrong, gluten elasticity shifts in a very predictable way. And in this video, I'll show you exactly what happens. Hi, I'm Sergio. I'm a professional pizza trainer from Italy based in France. And before looking at this kneading test, let's quickly go through the recipe and setup. So for this test, I'm realizing a direct dough for contemporary Neapolitan pizza. Let's look now at ingredients. I'm using a type 00 flour with a W index of 300, so I used here 1 kilo flour. Hydration, it's at 70%, so 700 grams. Yeast, this was fresh yeast, 0.3%, so 3 grams per kilo of flour. And salt, standard dosage of 2.5%, so 25 grams. What's interesting is to look at the actual proofing, as there is a clear link between kneading and proofing as regards to gluten elasticity. And so I'm doing a 3-hour bulk fermentation at room temperature of 21 degrees, followed by 36-hour final proofing at control temperature of 5 degrees. And the last information, very important, is the mixer that I used for this test. It's a spiral mixer with multiple speeds. What are the 4 mistakes that I've made during this kneading? The first one was about water temperature. With a spiral mixer, water should generally be at low temperature to allow the correct gluten formation. In this case, I used water at 23 degrees Celsius, which is definitely too high. The second mistake, I'm adding the 70% of hydration too quickly. In the first 5 minutes, all the water is basically added. For a dough with this level of hydration, the water needs to be added gradually throughout the kneading process, instead of rapidly at the beginning like I did. The result is that the dough is struggling to absorb the water, and as you can see, it starts to spread in the mixer. This is a sign of a weak gluten. Third mistake, given the first 2 mistakes, I'm working at low speed even though the dough would need a higher speed to increase its chances of forming the gluten. I started at 100 runs per minute and now I'm at 180. Fourth and last mistake, I'm stopping the kneading too soon. The overall kneading time here was just below 10 minutes. And this is definitely too short for this hydration and also for the mistakes that I've made. So what's the end result? You can see it here. The gluten is very weak and it breaks too easily. So basically it lacks the required elasticity. As the kneading is over, we can start to evaluate the consequences of a bad kneading process. The first one is right now, and it's the difficulty at working the dough. As you can see, the dough is quite sticky and it's weak, and I'm struggling a bit to take it out of the spiral mixer. The struggle continues when trying to do some folding, as the dough lacks elasticity and structure. Once I manage to form an homogeneous dough, I am forced to do some folding later on to give the dough some additional strength before the bulk fermentation. And this is another consequence of a bad kneading, the increasing overall preparation time. In fact, I need to wait 30 minutes to an hour and then do some folding instead of just leaving the dough to start its fermentation. So here it is, after 45 minutes, I'm doing some foldings and the dough looks much better. Now the dough can start the bulk fermentation. Here I'm leaving the dough for 3 hours at room temperature of 21 degrees Celsius. Before looking at the rest of the process with this incorrect gluten, let's look at how the gluten should have looked like during a good kneading. So here we have the dough just a few minutes before the end. As you can see, we have a more consolidated and solid structure. The dough is well compacted in the center of the spiral mixer, and this is how the gluten should look like at the end. Here I'm doing the window pane test, and the gluten shows this nice elastic feel. It's very thin, it doesn't break, and it feels more solid. And just to be clear, this was a test realized with the exact same hydration. The result you saw here and in the rest of the video doesn't come from fermentation or hydration. It starts at kneading. When making a dough, what matters is how elasticity is built and guided throughout the process. I explain this logic more globally in a short ebook on dough behavior. You'll find the link in the description. Let's now continue with the test and look at how elasticity evolves throughout the process. After the 3 hours bulk fermentation, it's time to prepare the dough balls. At this point of the process, I'm experiencing the same negative impact I already saw earlier: a sticky dough. In fact, a sticky dough can come from a bad kneading process, as the water and the flour have not been properly mixed together. On top of that, the fermentation process itself worsened the dough texture, making it stickier. I managed anyway to create the dough balls. And if you ever have a sticky dough, the proper way to work with it is to touch the dough quickly and decisively. The key is to avoid that the dough stays in your hands for too long. Just add some water or oil on your hands to help yourself. The next step is the final proofing. The length I choose here is 36 hours, as I wanted to push the dough beyond 24 hours and amplify the consequences of bad kneading. Here is the dough after 36 hours in the fridge. The first thing we notice is that the dough balls are in a square shape and they have bubbles on the surface. This means that the dough has too much extensibility and it's too weak. The bad kneading process has not given enough tenacity to our dough, and so the dough resting time cannot be too long. 36-hour rest, which is a resting time which shouldn't be a problem for a well-realized dough, it's too much for this dough. And the reason is that because the dough has not enough tenacity. Throughout the recipe, I could have adjusted the process to compensate for the incorrect kneading. Based on what you've seen, which variable would you have adjusted first? Let me know in the comments below. Let's look now at the dough during stretching. As we said, dough has a lot of extensibility and not enough tenacity. I need to stretch the dough very carefully. The lack of tenacity and elasticity at this stage is the greatest and the worst consequence of the bad kneading. I'm leaving here in the video the rest of the stretching and the baking just at higher speed so that you can see how the dough behaves. After cooking, the dough doesn't show any surprises. The excess in extensibility and the lack of tenacity means that the crust has developed too little, and then the crumb is quite dense and not light. On top of that, during tasting, the texture of the dough was not very light, as the baking was made quite difficult by the excess of extensibility. The squared shape of the pizza, it's also a sign of lack of elasticity. In fact, the pizza didn't keep its round shape while going into the oven. We can visualize even better the impact of an incorrect kneading on the gluten elasticity by looking at how the pizza should have looked like for this kind of recipe. Here is another contemporary Neapolitan pizza, but with the proper elasticity management throughout the process. The crust has developed properly, and when we look at the crumb structure, we can see that it is more developed, less dense, and that is going to give as well a nicer texture. What this test shows is that kneading does not only affect gluten elasticity. It defines how gluten elasticity is built from the very beginning. Once elasticity is shifted at kneading, every step that follows, fermentation, shaping, baking, is affected. Understanding this mechanism is the first step. If you want a structured way to think about this, the ebook it's below in the description. I'm Sergio, I'm a professional pizza trainer, and thanks for watching. Ciao!